Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to RUSI. We're delighted you can join us. Special welcome, as always, to RUSI members. Today, we are delighted to be joined by US Secretary of the Army, Ryan D. McCarthy, sworn in on September 30th last year and coming from a position as Under Secretary of the Army, a position which he held for 2 years. Secretary McCarthy served in the US Army from 1997 to 2002, was involved in combat operations in Afghanistan with the 75th Ranger Regiment, US Special Operations Command. Not new to policy, Secretary McCarthy previously served as the Special Assistant to SecDef Robert Gates under Presidents Bush and Obama. Before becoming Under Secretary of the Army, he worked for Lockheed Martin Corporation in a variety of vice presidential roles, but mostly around the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program and the company's global security policy. If you want to feel for the scope of the work, you need to look at McCarthy's actions as Under Secretary of the Army. The COO in business speak of a mind-bogglingly complex organization. Here he embarked on a project of modernization of platforms that were almost 40, maybe 45 years old, at the end of their incremental upgrade pathways. The huge platform costs were going to be just unmanageable, even for the US budget. And McCarthy devised a new way of programming the recapitalization of equipment, a bold new way that takes the Army, the US Army, through a new vision. As Secretary, now he has statutory responsibility for all matters relating to the US Army. It includes recruitment, organization, training, equipping, and care of not just active duty, but also National Guard reserve soldiers, Department of Army civilians, and their families. But in this role at this time, there's been so much more. On COVID-19, he's managed an organization with 1.1 million service personnel in uniform, 300,000 civilian workers, and 2 million families across 140 countries around the world, with only 4,000 COVID-19 cases. The US Army is also playing a leading role in vaccine development and in the future distribution. On diversity, he's undertaken a different way of tackling racism and sexism, moving from generic forms of training and tick box tests to airing some sometimes painful vignettes from service members to instill a sort of team of teams approach. This has pushed Army leaders at all levels out of their comfort zone. But it's returning to that era of great power competition that we'll talk about today. His articulation of that challenge is clear. The need as the US Army to mentally shift from a mantra of working like a boxer, going in, delivering the knockout punch and then going home, to one of an infinite game, not seeking victory per se, but an acknowledgement that this is a generational competition. In the US, as in the UK, the Army has been intellectually leading the military machine for over a decade. Multi-domain battle became the centerpiece of the 2017 National Security Strategy, and the US Army Futures Command is the most outgoing, intellectually curious army formation in the world. Those ideas are going to be crucial in the years ahead because MDO, beyond MDO, because the competition is about ideas and decisions, dilemmas and pathways. These occur in people's minds and not on platforms. And they happen where people live, not in the air, not in space or on the high seas. But Secretary McCarthy is really clear about the role of military force. The US Army, he has said, is not the Peace Corps. Death, destruction and violence are its stock in trade. Thank you very much, Secretary McCarthy, for joining us. We're also joined by James Heappey MP, Minister of the Armed Forces for the UK. James was elected as Conservative Member of Parliament for the Wells constituency in May 2015. Before entering politics, James too had a military career, serving in the British Army and reaching the rank of Major. In a 10-year career in the Rifles, James served in operations in Kabul in 2005, Northern Ireland in 2006, Basra in 2007, Sangin in Helmand in 2009, but he's also served in Kenya and right across the UK. James was originally appointed as Minister for Defence Procurement in December 2019, having previously served as Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Prime Minister. He became Parliamentary Under Secretary of State and Minister of the Armed Forces in February 2020. We won't talk about the UK forces contribution to COVID-19 because James Heappey is coming back later this week to RUSI to talk about that then. Listen, the format for this is going to be very much, we're going to allow Secretary McCarthy to make some opening statements, but he said he wants to engage with you, the audience. So after he's had a chance to speak, we'll ask for a quick response from James Heapy, and then we're going to go into question and answer. These will happen online, and we'll ask people to jump in and put your questions all online, and I will try and then filter them to come up with the themes, to pull out the interesting questions and to feed them to, and we'll keep going until we have a hard stop time at 17:30. But with that introduction done, this is really about the Secretary of the US Army. So Secretary McCarthy, the floor is yours.
Can you hear us? Sorry, I have to defer to my host for just a couple minutes first, if that's okay.
Oh, well, Ryan, that's kind of you. Thank you very much for plugging the thing on Wednesday. It would be great to draw some lessons from the great response of Her Majesty's Armed Forces to COVID-19. And I think from that comes some lessons for the integrated review. The big crowd, Ryan, this is a sort of bigger crowd than I would get on RUSI on a Monday afternoon, have come to hear you and to understand what the American Army is up to. But it's great to know that in the office that I man-mark in the Pentagon as a fellow veteran, I'm not sure that we ex-soldiers are always the best ministers and secretaries, because we tend to think that that we should have been generals and that we now are. But at the same time, there's a sort of empathy for our armed forces that comes with having served, and it's great that there's a fellow ex-soldier with whom we can sort of share some stories and work together to do great things. The world is changing in a really interesting way at the moment, and US foreign policy appears to us to be changing in a really interesting way. But I hope that throughout all of that change in foreign policy, what will stand steady is the importance of our friendship and our alliance, and the importance of interoperability between our armed forces, and particularly between our two armies. The MOU, or the MOA, that we've had the opportunity to sign here this afternoon focuses on networks, long-range precision fires, future vertical lift, soldier and ground lethality, and assured positioning, navigation and timing, all of which are going to be absolutely essential to the land battles of the future, and all of which I think give great opportunity for companies in the defense industry on both sides of the Atlantic to contribute to that program and to achieve the prosperity aims of both of our governments. I had the pleasure in both Iraq and Afghanistan and serving closely with the US Army in particular. I know what an amazing bunch of people is that you have the privilege to be the political lead for. It's humbling to be the political lead for the UK Armed Forces. I hope that our two armies will be ever closer, both in terms of the technology they use, their ethos, and their fighting spirit when they're up against our shared adversaries. Welcome. We're looking forward to hear what you've got to say.
It's wonderful to be here, James. And I think that, as you mentioned, the prior service nature of our careers, in 2001, in the fall of 2001, when I served in the Ranger Regiment and showed up in an island off the coast of Oman, the first people I saw in the hangar were Her Majesty's 2-2 SAS. And when America needed you all the most, you were the first ones on station. And something that, for as long as I live, and the 19 years since, and for as long as I live, I'll fight to protect this relationship to my dying breath. And it's great to be back here in the United Kingdom, to be able to continue the work that we work together to strengthen this extraordinary partnership for many, many years to come. And we can talk in detail about our discussions today and the work that lies ahead of us. As I mentioned, since 9/11, much has been asked of our two armies. 19 years of sustained combat operations in the Middle East. We both face challenges here at the home here in the UK as well as in the United States and everywhere with the COVID pandemic. We've dealt with some challenging geopolitical issues along the way, and we've had challenges in the United States that has billowed out to other nations as well with civil unrest. And there are challenges that were alluded to in this opening discussion. But it's the sort of thing where I emphasize every time in public that we have to, as a U.S. Army, face all of these fronts and deliver for our country. So it's a great opportunity for us to meet with RUSI and to talk about the journey that we've been on together. In particular, in the last 4 years, we have restored readiness in the U.S. Army, where we had only a handful of our brigade combat teams at the highest levels of readiness. Today, having over half of them at the highest levels of readiness. The modernization efforts that we've endured, we've realigned over $50 billion across our future years defense plan, a 5-year planning horizon to finance our ambition in the midst of flat budgets and undoubtedly fiscal challenges that will face us in the years to come. Because our national defense strategy that was published in the January of 2018 recognized of the challenges of near-peer competition, violent extremist organizations, as well as the changes of weapon systems that are roughly 45 to 50 years old. You just can't engineer another ounce out of these systems. So as we look at these threats, along with dealing with a global pandemic and the need for us to address racial tension at home, it's an extraordinary time. Our formation has performed extremely well because of the crucible of combat that we faced over the last 19 years. It is the most seasoned group of combat leaders in the history of the United States Army. And the results are significant at every echelon. Our men and women are swinging well above their weight. So it is the privilege of a lifetime to be in this position. And I will do it for as long as they'll let me. Our mission here today, that with our discussion with Minister Heapy and all his colleagues here at the Defense Ministry, was largely about how can we look at in the enhanced exercises that we conduct here on the European continent and all over the world, but also the joint modernization efforts. Can we collaborate together? Last fall, we launched an effort that looked at how can we improve collaboration on modernization in the forms of long-range precision fires, our networks, future vertical lift platforms, soldier lethality, whether that's next generation squad weapons or enhanced night vision goggles, as well as position navigation and timing. We signed a memorandum of agreement that was non-binding in nature, but ultimately something that can provide the momentum and emphasis from the senior leaders on the civilian side of our respective organizations to drive towards these outcomes. You'll be seeing many U.S. Army generals coming here to the United Kingdom over the course of the fall, working at the finite level details and to present opportunities for both of our countries economically as well as militarily. The world is a complex and dangerous place on a good day. And the lights with an event, this global pandemic that we face has made it all the more complex. But we have to continue to address security challenges. I've been wearing my mask, I've been washing my hands, I've been getting tested almost weekly. It's important that we recognize that our social distancing, as you see, we're apart from each other, to keep our formations healthy. The successes that you mentioned in the opening comments are largely because of the extraordinary leaders at every echelon that we have in the U.S. Army and the discipline that we have in our formation. I'm very proud of that. Very proud of the vaccine development work as well. It's being led by a U.S. Army 4-star named Gus Perna, who was 3 weeks away from retirement. And we asked Gus to hang in there for one more. And he immediately accepted that mantle and has been driving the efforts in the United States. And we're excited. We believe we'll see advanced therapeutics, robust therapeutics to address this in the mid-fall, and as well as vaccines to hit the street as late as Christmas of this year. So we're very excited about the efforts underway. Medical Research and Development Command, U.S. Army, has been central to the U.S. efforts, and we'll work every day until we win. And with that, I'd be happy to take all of your questions. Or maybe not all of them. We could give James some too.
No, you crack on.
I think it's interesting. We've had 5 or 6 in already, and there's one theme that comes out sort of more than anything else, and it's about, almost unsurprisingly, you know, with the two of you there, with the two flags behind you, very emblematic, you know, the special relationship, and almost without looking at each other, that there is quite a difficult discussion that's had in the UK about, you know, politically talking about the special relationship is always a good thing, and from an analyst point of view, and you know, our members and audience as well are there thinking, you know, well, what actually does the US get from the UK in terms of special relationship? You know, we used to have niche capabilities in intelligence, perhaps. We used to have differentiated rifles in main tanks. We used to have different ways of operating with special forces. We used to have different aircraft. And it seems now the UK is moving more towards a mini US in its model. It's buying more and more stuff off the shelf from the US. So what is it that the US really want from the UK? To Mike Maiden's question, you know, what is it in land power specifically that the US wants from the UK? Is it simply a case of you just like us being there on day one? Is it you know, is it great for alliance and alliance building, or is there something more? Is there something that UK land power offers you that you can't get from elsewhere?
Well, there's nothing more powerful than an ally that will stand shoulder to shoulder with you in a firefight. So the first and foremost, the men and women of this extraordinary military being there when you need them the most. It's a group of seasoned combat leaders, very similar. I mean, it would stand alone amongst the history in the UK of seasoned combat leaders like Mark Carlton Smith and Ivan Jones and others who have had extraordinary distinguished combat records. But it's also those units have unique capabilities like SAS, like the Royal Marines, like the RAF. These are people businesses. So investments do matter, absolutely. And there are unique capabilities that the UK brings in electronic warfare and TAC aviation and others, avionics payloads like you see, and very sophisticated weapon systems. But at the end of the day, it's about people, and the people that have to work together. And that's how you win in combat at the end of the day. So I think you can see a variety from materiel, but it's also from the people perspective. And that's what we really value so much. We are truly intertwined when you have an exchange program where we have one-star officers from the British military perform the role as deputy commanding generals of American divisions. And those are not hood ornaments. They are genuinely in there leading and driving these combat organizations. So we look at it from more than just the materiel, but clearly there's investments that we talked about today, that there are opportunities that present for each other for the next generation of capabilities that will fill our combined arms formations.
And is there something, you know, is there something you're looking for? Is there something, you know, is it around light? Is it around armored? Is there something where you hope that the British Army, British Land Forces will have a specific capability that they can offer you, or is it across the board? Is it the full spectrum, the full suite of stuff, or is there somewhere that you would love to see the British focus?
Well, you know, we listed out about 4 or 5 pretty diverse sets of portfolios of capabilities. What really, when the UK comes out of the integrated review, a lot of that will be able to see how the cards fall, and whether or not they'll pursue these other developmental opportunities. So the timing is very unique, which is why it was great we could get over here and have this discussion so they can have a very informed view as they make some very complex decisions that are transforming the UK military for decades to come. So we presented a lot of opportunities. They've got to digest this over the next several months and make some choices.
Just turning very quickly to the people, and maybe you want to linger on this for a little bit. It was interesting that you brought out people as that key facet that the UK provided, not just in terms of political acceptability, but the quality of people that you're getting. There are quite a lot of professional exchanges, but most importantly, in many ways, those exchanges that happen during professional military education, right? So the opportunity for American officers to come and study for a long period of time on our staff courses, and likewise for the British to go over to the US. How important is it in the US for you as Secretary of the Army? Do these rate very highly? Are they things that you really look for when you're picking future commanding officers as A's and everything else? Are these things that you really value?
Absolutely. But I just, Colonel Ed Sandry, who was a British exchange officer in headquarters Department of the Army, he sat in meetings all the time about modernization and exercises. We valued him very well. He had an office call with me before he left, and he's coming home and doing a year before he deploys to Iraq back in the UK. So, our militaries have performed so well by the power of relationships and understanding of each other and our strengths and how we can apply them and complement each other and win in battlefield. So it's incredibly important. What we've talked about in our staff talks, which CGS Mark Harlan Smith meets with my colleague, General Jim McConville, that they're looking at constant reevaluation. Are they in the right places? From training and doctrine to how our forces command, where we have all of our active units, to the modernization effort. We have a UK L&O and Army Futures Command in Austin, Texas, who sits in all these discussions, which is why we've moved so quickly to identify 5 key areas where we think we may want to invest together. So having them in the right places has made us move faster. And over the long haul, you'll see those investments over time because all these men and women are rising to the highest echelons of the formation, and will make much better decisions and quite frankly, as we face the next conflict, perform much better.
And as we start talking about the conflict and where this event is about great power competition, we've sort of avoided the elephant in the room, which is China, right? I mean, this is where great power competition exists. It's not necessarily on the fields of Northern Europe or in the North Atlantic. The real competition is happening in the Indo-Pacific, maybe the Arctic as well, certainly the Antarctic. Can you talk to us a little bit about forward basing, about the power of forward basing as you see it, and how the US is going to develop this?
Quite frankly, I think we're competing everywhere. Africa, the Middle East, as well as in Europe as well. With I think so. If you look at the near peer competitor that is China, their One Belt, One Road initiative is everywhere. With respect to the forward basing, we look at expeditionary basing so that you can dynamically force employ capabilities, units around the world. So if instead of having them forward deployed, they can come from home station or other places. So you don't have this kind of go trail you constantly go down, but it brings different perspectives and potentially dilemmas.
And is there, this is Alexander Wilson's question, is there a desire for you to, for the US to get Europe and the UK to concentrate on Europe and counter Russia while you take on China? Or is this a far more global approach that you're talking about?
I think that that the UK can compete globally, that they have the capabilities and the will as a country to compete globally, and quite frankly, we need them to. So it's I would never see them as a regional player.
But that comes with cost, doesn't it? I mean, Deborah Haynes's point that she's raised here, the UK government is set to announce on Tuesday a U-turn in its earlier decision to allow Huawei a role in the UK's future 5G network. How important is that decision in terms of the UK-US relationship, in terms of the interoperability of the armed forces, the growing importance of technology, the MOU, the memorandum of agreement that you've signed today? Is this good news for you? Is this bad news? I mean, how much damage potentially did Huawei make on the relationship?
On 2 biscuits before answering that question. Deborah's son was interrupted her in an interview the other day, and the price was 2 biscuits before she was allowed to carry on.
Clearly, this is a big decision for the United Kingdom. I think that it's important for them as they approach this to really appreciate that you need to have a reliable carriers play, and ones that could not be easily manipulated or create disruption or the potential for espionage. So the United States is watching this very closely. We're advising our allies to make best informed decisions that they can possible and look at other options, other technologies or other carriers. But it is truly something that could become a tremendous threat to national security.
Well, and that leads on to, I guess, Paul Ellis's question when you talk about the change, these new weapons, this new way. Paul Ellis has asked, as General Sir Nick Carter said to the Defense Select Committee, the character of war has changed. Do you subscribe to that view? And if so, how is the US Army going to respond to these new threats? I mean, multi-domain operations, multi-domain battle that came out of the US Army has been transformational in the short term. The short-term fight it's a huge change, right? But beyond that, there is something else that's going to be needed to cope with this distinct change of the 6 big technologies that are approaching us. So
it's a lot of it's what James and I talked about today is you have great power competition basically being the line below armed conflict, kinetic events. And where you see the world today with information operations and the way and manner in which they can posture themselves, cyber, other things, before a shot was ever fired. You can create a distinct advantage for country X or Y based upon how you compete at that level. We call those long-range effects before you would ever apply a long-range precision fire prosecuting a target with a missile or munition. I would agree with all of the comments, by the way, but I would say that has become distinct in this environment, coupled with some extraordinary investments and innovative technologies that have created much greater capability for anti-access area denial capabilities for near-peer competitors, which you used my boxer wrestler analogy earlier. It recognizes the fact that if you push out the capabilities of force projection, in this case for the United States of America, but also for the United Kingdom, it inhibits your ability to get close enough for consistency in sortie generation, consistency of putting boots on the ground to enable combat operations. It creates challenges. So it makes us have to relook our decision of our business model and how we make decisions. That's why long-range precision fires is the #1 investment priority of the U.S. Army, why low Earth orbit satellite architecture is essential to enable the long-range fires, why an integrated, interoperable network with cloud architecture is essential for us to pass data to each other when we fight in the future. So it has made us invest differently, train differently, and continue to look at ways to transform ourselves for the fights that potentially face us in the future.
We have this really good model in the UK developed by the British Army, the Armoury Operating Concept, which follows directly on from multi-domain operations, and it seeks to find a way to use the UK's capability in a way that is useful, that provides leverage, that is, a missing round that you do not have, and it's a way of operating rather than actual things. But the UK in Europe and across your allies is really struggling to keep up with your pace of change. I mean, you're setting a ferocious tempo, and you have to. I think everyone gets that. But are you concerned that you're starting to leave allies behind? I mean, people just cannot keep up with the pace of change that you're setting, the modernization program that you've got. And it's not just in equipment. It's in data links, it's in standards, and it's in your way of thinking. I mean, frankly, Europe in many ways in military thinking is quite a slow, sedate pace. You're moving at lightning speed, and everyone is trying to keep up. But there are definitely 3 different ways of operating. Do you worry that sometimes you're going to leave allies behind?
That's why I'm sitting in London right now talking to my colleague James. Absolutely, the United States does not fight alone. We fight alongside our allies. We want to make sure that we present all the opportunities that we can bring to support our allies. And I think that the pace is necessary. technology changes so quickly in this environment that it's necessary that we recognize that why we reorganized and compressed our modernization timeframe so we can get a requirement on a weapons system in 18 months or less, and we can start testing within 3 years, and why we have weapon systems landing now. But we have our commitment to the UK and all of our allies is that we want to present the opportunities. Big part of that is communication. You got to sit across from each other and make choices. And that's why I wanted to get here before the integrated review was so far down the path that they knew what we wanted to bring to the table and present to them. But we'll never leave the allies behind.
And if I may, I mean, I think that we go into this eyes wide open. I suspect your closest friends elsewhere around the world will be doing likewise. America can do a scale of change and a pace of change that goes with having the largest defense budget on earth. And I think what it steers us towards doing is asking ourselves, well, which are the areas in which we can add value that will be really sort of wanted, needed, appreciated by the US, that will allow us to be in the parts of the world that are important to us as the United Kingdom, that we know will be useful to you as our best friend and ally. And then we choose to take those areas of capability forward. And for us, that means that we have to make decisions to sunset, to use CDS's term, capabilities elsewhere. But that is the decision that we have to make. And I bet the same is the case of the Japanese and the French and the Germans and the Koreans and the Italians and lots of other countries besides. But that is, I think, how one develops an alliance, how one takes a friendship forward and makes sure that you do what is in the interest of your own country, whilst also recognizing what it is that you bring to the partnerships that you have around the globe to make sure that you're a useful friend in time of crisis.
And Australia's recent, white paper absolutely did that, right? I mean, it nailed those choices and it put them in a very military-focused way that delivered things that were useful to the US, but also useful for Australia. But since, Minister, you've opened yourself up, could I just ask whether you see the integrated review going light? I mean, despite the discussions you've had with Secretary McCarthy, Number 10's integrated review task force might be thinking very different things from what's coming out of the MOD. Do you see that as a real risk?
No, I mean, I think that there's some very interesting. Well, I was warned that this was the case, being a defence minister during a defence review, that you read stuff on Sundays that seems completely out of kilter with anything you've heard in meetings during the week. And that was definitely the case with the Daily Mirror story this weekend just gone. I actually think that we're all in broadly the same place. We recognise that our backyard is the Euro-Atlantic, but that with Brexit comes an increased international ambition that would see us operating farther afield more frequently. We recognise that the rise of China brings with it challenge not just for the US, but for European powers too. And we recognise that there are the speed of technological advancement that is embraced by adversaries, be they state or non-state actors, means that sometimes you have to go quite a long way in order to find your enemy and deal with them. And that brings with it a set of requirements for the UK that we too, just as Ryan spoke to you about the US discussions around forward presence, in a much more humble way, we are having the same around how we can forward base some of our ships, how we can forward base some of our troops in order to be in the right place at the right time to deal with the challenges that lie ahead. So I actually think that Number 10, the Foreign Office, the MOD are all broadly in the same place. And I think what's interesting is that the MOD and the Pentagon seem to be sort of broadly in the same place, albeit we have a slightly smaller wallet.
Well, thank you for that, Minister. But listen, if I can turn back to Secretary McCarthy, Peter Frankopan is one of the UK's greatest minds. I want to read his question to you direct. Could the Secretary say something about the triage in thinking about threats and challenges outside great power rivals like China and Russia? How about states that are in stress or failure in the Sahel, in South America, in the Middle East, and non-state actors, including those that engage in crypto and cybercrime? what kind of changes are going on in assessing how to handle the problems outside of great power competition that each of all of these might pose in 2030, 2040?
So really the only way we can, as a country, address those are from what we call an intergovernmental approach within our National Security Council. Would bring the elements, all the instruments of American power, our State Department, our Commerce Department, as well as the Defense Department, to apply the soft power capabilities, as well as the advise and assist, and if necessary, to counter violent extremist organizations with our special operations. But in those cases, we try to bring the capabilities, all the capabilities of our government. But a lot of it comes down to our ability to manage risk. You can see this on 3 or 4 different continents. And even to the extent of the vast resources at the disposal of the American Department of Defense, there are limits. And there are limits to how much you can address all of these challenges. So how we work with our allies is essential, and being able to complement each other. But we have had to make some adjustments in how do you address challenges that may fester and become a security threat to the United States in a decade. A lot of that is our risk management.
And you see a very different sort of risk management appetite in other places of the world. I mean, in Europe, it's notable that, you know, force design is not geared necessarily around the high intensity fight. I mean, it's geared around the conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa. It's geared around the conflicts in North Africa. It's geared around, you know, countering elements of Russian aggression, perhaps in the Baltic or in the North. But the US has a very different view, right? I mean, your force design of the US Army is geared around great power competition, about meeting high intensity conflict, you know, with sort of fist on fist, at range, at pace, correct?
I would say the preponderance of the capabilities in the U.S. Army. It's important to recognize we created 6 advise and assist brigades just within the last 24 months that we use regional alignment, Africa, South America, Middle East, East Asia, for example. 6 of these brigades that do just specifically advise and assist roles. We have one in Africa right now. We have one in the Middle East right now. We have one gearing up to go to East Asia. And what they do is present these very seasoned officers, non-commissioned officers, very senior in grade in each level. And what they do is come in as those subject matter expertise and help train and advise and assist other militaries grow their capabilities over time. So we have made some adjustments, but I would, as a whole, predominantly the hard power.
Yeah, it's right there front and center. I mean, it sort of suits this great power competition, you know, narrative that sits there. But those forces that you design for that kind of conflict often aren't those ones that have the greatest impact in the sort of the gray space, the hybrid space, the threshold, or whatever you want to call it. And that tension becomes quite difficult, because when you only have a hammer to apply, you know, where you want the nuance, it's much more difficult. Would you agree with that?
Yes, we've developed what we call a multi-domain task force. And in a multi-domain task force, it brings long-range precision effects as well as long-range precision fire. So more specifically, intelligence, cyber, electronic warfare. So in the competition space, as well as advise and assist capabilities, but also long-range precision fires, precision strike missiles, which are the replacement for the ATACMS. We're developing hypersonic glide body missiles, which are on track for the FY23 timeframe. So for fielding, we have these capabilities where you're going to bring, whether it's below the line of armed conflict or above, changing the formations, and you'll see more and more of that over time.
And that leads me to David Bates's question. Is sort of more or less on this point about the grey space. Do you believe that within the DIME mnemonic, diplomacy, informational, military, and economic, between those levers, do you believe that the DIE, diplomacy, influence or information, and economic, that those levers will become more important than the military in campaign to, you know, counter operations in the grey space?
I think they'll become much more important, but the hard power capabilities will always have to be there and have vast investment. But I do say more and more in the competition space, we have to be able to enable all of those capabilities in a synchronized fashion. And that's the key, is the synchronization of all of those efforts.
There's quite a few questions that sort of turn away from China and want to talk about Russia in particular. I mean, I'll pick out a few of them. One of them is about Arctic security, which I think is interesting, and it crosses over between China's slightly amazing ambitions to be a Arctic neighbor. But this idea that Russia sort of now exercises control over most of the Arctic ice sheet. Do you see this part of Russian operations being a clear part of their sort of hybrid warfare, lawfare being employed within it?
Their activities have picked up substantially over the last several years. My colleague, General McConville, was just there yesterday in Alaska, meeting with all U.S. forces. The Arctic strategy for the U.S. Department of Defense is adjusting, and you'll see a lot more on that in the months and years to come. But there's definitely been an uptick in their activities, and we've taken notice.
And of course, it's right to say, I mean, the Royal Marines for the UK are, the cold warfare specialists and are doing much more up there. But it feels almost like we have ceded some ground to Russia in the Arctic in the past 20 years by taking our eye off the ball, and to retake possession of some of that even conceptual space from them is going to take some considerable effort. Would you agree?
They've been very aggressive with their posture up there. There are moves that be made to mitigate much of that, but it is a place in the world where we're going to have to compete and be much more prevalent.
And do you think Russia, historically for Europe, Russia has always been, the greatest threat, for the past 75 years. Do you see Russia as a military threat to Europe still, or do you think that it doesn't really represent that? It's exercising power by the means, and it does it, politically, it does it, economically, and it is pretty good at inserting itself into European affairs of a variety of ways. But does it feel to you like it's a military threat to Europe?
We always are prepared to deal with a military threat to support our allies in Europe.
No, I get that, but come on, the question was, do you see Russia as a military threat to Europe?
I don't dare to try to understand Russian intentions.
Okay. We're going to move on. It was. I can see I'm not going to get anywhere on this line of questioning at all, am I? But listen, can we just move on slightly, because the US Army has had a really interesting experience with COVID. And I know in particular that you have talked about the lessons that you have learned and thinking about transferring those to the wider army, sort of big army, particularly about fighting in a CBRN environment, which is something that most states have not really thought about in a while. I mean, we've been in a beautiful place where we've had, pretty unpleasant adversaries, but they haven't stepped over that boundary of chemical and biological weapon use that we have seen quite a lot of in Syria. And in many ways, I think a lot of us are worrying that there's a normalization about chemical and biological weapons that we've seen in Syria. Do you worry that those are going to proliferate and potentially be used on a future battlefield?
Absolutely. We've learned a great deal with this COVID pandemic, and it's made us take a very hard look at ourselves at how do we invest to deal with these types of threats, whether it's on the back end with the types of mop gear you got to wear, or on the front end, and how do we invest against vaccines to protect all of our soldiers and their families. And I think that it's made us realize vulnerabilities. The dirty fight, the bee and the Bernie, it's always the painful stuff you don't want to talk about, but it's put it front and center for us to deal with. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, how remarkable at every echelon our leaders have performed against this in this environment, and how we've been able to train. We test our folks, we put them into a bubble out in the field, and they go out and they do company level live fires, and they do our business. But we find ways to keep them in safety bubbles so we can continue to work on collective training. We turned collective training back on a few weeks ago at the higher echelons. We have units in our Joint Readiness Training Center. We have one entering the National Training Center this month. So thousands of soldiers going into these bubbles to train. And we're going to keep them healthy and stay sharp with all of those key collective tasks.
May I don't know if you've experienced the same on your side of the pond, but I would share the observations you've made around relearning the importance of being able to fight in a CBRN environment. I think we've also learned some lessons around the sort of resilience of our home base and some of the contracts that we've got around maintenance of key platforms, some of the industry bringing forward new equipment, actually how we made that more resilient so that things don't get knocked off track by events like a pandemic. Has given us plenty to think about, not just away from home, but actually the resilience of the home base as well. It's been quite an eye-opening couple of months from which to learn some quite important lessons.
No, we've tried to share in our military staff talks protocols that we've learned and things that can be potential pitfalls. The unique one in particular, I know that our teams have shared, is on initial entry training. So we get young men and women from every corner of America, and we have to bring them to 4 unique locations. In the southeastern United States and central United States, where we have these training locations, and how we've been able to move tens of thousands of people and keep them healthy. And a lot of it is just testing and discipline. But we are looking very hard at changing the business model of Medical Research and Development Command in the Army, and how we invest against the research of infectious diseases. And there will be considerable change to that in the years over the next several years.
I get that, but the reality is it's pretty hard to prepare people in any different way from putting on mop gear and living in it for a week, right? I mean, that is one of the hardest things you can do, let alone participate in a firefight. To eat, drink, sleep, and live in mop gear over a week is something that is a forgotten skill set in most armies, certainly in the West. Would you concur with that? Something you would like to see change?
We started doing a lot more of that over the last really 18 months in the U.S. Army, fighting in mop gear. Now, were they doing it for a week to 10 days? I don't think so, but they were doing it over 24, 48-hour periods to try to put the stress on them to see how they perform. I think that General McConville is looking at the scenarios of how hard we dial it up on units that go through these the Joint Readiness Training Centers, or where we have our combined training centers. We bring larger formations to train units. So we are going to dial up the stress and to see how we can do in that environment. But it is something we started over the last 18 months, and we'll have to continue to press upon for years to come.
I want to chop very quickly, because there's a whole nother raft of questions that exists around, the US view over institutions. And specifically, we're talking NATO and the UN. I mean, and the US has a history of a difficult history with both in many ways, particularly the intransigence of others within them. What do you see as the future of these, of these two organizations? Do you see that, the stymieing position of the UN Security Council means that, a new way needs to be found there? Do you find that there needs to be a 2-speed NATO? Is there a big way ahead that you can see coming out of the continental US that looks at these big institutions and said, this is how we need to adapt them and play with them?
There's always a tension in these relationships, because we all have our own agendas, but they have obviously great equities that we share. So it is largely the investment of time between senior leaders and communicating with each other. COVID has made it very difficult. We're all on the phones or Zoom or Microsoft Teams, right? So it becomes, you lose that people touch. And that's what we felt over the last really 4 to 5 months in particular. But do I see these two bodies that you mentioned are essential to create global order and to force hard conversations to deal with these geopolitical problems. So I'll tell you from where I sit, I will push very hard to be a participant in those bodies and bring these tough issues to the table.
And a final question, because or a final area of questions really, it is going back to the people part, and you know, being you're not Navy or Air Force, so it's otherwise we'd be sat talking platforms no end. So we can talk about people, which is lovely to have a leader talking about that rather than just simply lots and lots of kit. But Rory East makes a really good point. He says you mentioned the well-developed combat experience of both US and UK soldiers and commanders that's been cultivated over the past 19 years, mostly through counterinsurgency operations. With the US pivot out of theaters such as the Middle East and West Africa, maybe a moot point, and towards great power competition, do you still see the opportunity for future military leaders to gain and maintain this vitally important combat experience without the presence of theaters such as Iraq and Afghanistan? Really, how are you going to maintain the combat experience of your future leaders?
So it's a great question. You look at just the sheer volume of firefights that a Mark Milley, our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, or Jim McConville, our chief of staff, had. Their 3 to 4 or 5 years in combat between the two of them, about 8 or 10 years total, is extraordinary. Every day they were in firefights. So the repetitions that they have will be the greatest, probably, at least for now, the greatest probably in the history of the U.S. Army, because it was even more and over and above World War II, the sheer volume that they participated in. Today, it's significantly less. So it is a simple math problem in many cases for even when they deploy to Afghanistan or other places, Afghanistan or Iraq, they're just not getting in the firefights like they did in 2007, 8, 9, 10, even from 01 to 2011, really. So you're not going to have the same number and volume of repetitions. And in many cases, there'll be the special operators that are going to be out prosecuting targets, air assault raids, things of that nature. So that is something you have to be conscious of. But weapon systems are becoming so much more lethal now that it's changing. That's the comments we've had repeatedly about the changing nature of warfare. They're getting greater range, greater lethality. So as things adjust, skill sets will have to adjust. We're developing a variety of skill sets just within our ranks of data scientists and more cyber capability because warfare is changing. But as a whole, on the hard power side, they will be having less repetitions. They have for several years now. And there is a bit of a difference. The good thing is, if you look at it from about 04 majors to our 4-star generals, extraordinary amount of combat experience, and it's made the training more realistic and much tougher for the young men and women joining our formation today.
But I thought that was a really interesting question, and I sort of wonder. You and I are of a similar generation in terms of our service, and I'm not sure that we joined armies where everybody in your company, everybody in your battalion had been in a live firefight. But actually sort of the platoon attack, the company attack, the battalion attack, they are drills that are honed on exercises. What makes our current generation of commanders extraordinary is not just their experience of kinetic combat, it's their experience of working alongside one another, their international careers, the interoperability, the shared understanding. And I think that, as we draw down in Iraq and Afghanistan, and assuming that there isn't something of that scale on the horizon in which the UK and US works together, the big challenge for Ryan and I now is how do we give our people that closeness, those relationships as they go through their careers that maintains that shared understanding? Because I just think that's the battle winner when the US and the UK are operating alongside one another.
Absolutely.
The final question I want to take is a topical one, and it's about recruitment, but really it's about diversity. I mean, achieving diversity in a military force structure is really difficult, and I get that. But the drive towards greater diversity is more important than ever as we understand both what diversity brings in terms of making decisions and making the right decisions and assessing the information. How do you think that the US Army is going to do better in diversity in the future?
So we've tried to take some initial steps with that regard of looking at the elements of a promotion board, how you evaluate an individual. And starts with a series of paperwork, we call it an officer evaluation report, and then their officer record brief, which is just your life history, where you went to college, all the military schools you went to, all your assignments. And the first thing we did is we took the photograph off to try to eliminate unconscious bias. And the next thing we're going to look at is we need to take all their names off. And we just see the body of work of individual X versus Y. Because even if you're trying to look for diversity, there are unconscious biases. I grew up in Chicago, Irish Catholic background, are you more comfortable around that versus others? Dependent upon life experiences, you may be very comfortable with other things. But the first thing we look at is the unconscious biases that may affect a promotion board. The other thing that we've done in the U.S. is we changed our strategy about 2 years ago to focus on 22 cities around the United States of America. Our cities represent the greatest diversity in ethnodemographics, larger pools of not only Caucasians, but Latinos, African Americans, Asia Pacific, and it affords us the opportunity to recruit more of these young men and women because they're just larger sample sizes. And you can focus the resources in such an area where you can find as many from these diverse demographics as possible that meet our standards. So we tried to do a lot of things differently. On the recruiting front, with changing the different cities, it's helped us increase with women. We've increased with African Americans. We're flat with Latin Americans, and we're really working that harder. But it presents opportunities. So you've got to get them in the formation, and then you got to be able to put the promotion systems to be as unbiased as possible. But then it's also talent management. They have to get the right assignments and the right schools, and they need mentors. Mentors advocate for you, but also mentors show you what right looks like, how to behave, and continue to perform at every level as you go up the echelons of the business. And at the end of the day, trying to get as many young men and women from every different demographic to be in the core elements of our business. What I tell soldiers all the time, if you want to be General Jim McConville, our Chief of Staff, infantry, armor, aviation, artillery, the core elements of our business. So it'll be like in manufacturing, if you don't know how to make the product and sell it and finance it, you're not going to be the CEO. So from the standpoint of you want to be Chief of Staff of the Army, you got to understand the key elements of the business.
Secretary McCarthy, Minister, that was great. There are so many questions. I can't do justice to them. I'd like to thank the audience for just a fantastic array of really smart intelligence questions that came in that made my job really easy. And I'm sorry if I didn't get round to yours or I asked it in the wrong way. I can only apologize. But gentlemen, it has been a real pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for sharing your time. Really enlightening. We covered a huge canvas, which you painted beautifully. So thank you both very much. And Minister, we look forward to seeing you later in the week for the next event.
I'm looking forward to it too. Great job, Ryan. Really well done.
Thank you for having me. I would just leave all of your participants, thank you for participating, stay healthy, but to be very encouraged by the leadership that represent here in the Defense Ministry, Minister Heapy, Sir Simon Ballum, CGS, Mark Carlton Smith. These are extraordinary individuals, and we're lucky to have them as allies.
That's kind. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.